July 1, 1964. Vinh Long Province, South Vietnam. The rice paddies shimmer under the midday sun, but the beauty is deceptive. Somewhere below, in the maze of tree lines and irrigation ditches, American advisors and Army of the Republic of Vietnam soldiers are pinned down. The radio crackles with desperation. Casualties are mounting. They need extraction. They need it now. Major Charles L. Kelly is already airborne. His UH-1B Huey, tail number 63-08363, bears the call sign, Dustoff 36. The helicopter is painted olive drab with one distinction that sets it apart from every other aircraft in the theater. A red cross on a white square. No door guns, no rocket pods, no minigun mounts. Just 4 men, a stretcher rack, and a radio frequency that every wounded man in Vietnam knows by heart. Kelly approaches the landing zone. Ground fire erupts immediately. Tracers arc through the humid air like angry hornets. The crew chief sees muzzle flashes from the tree line, maybe 75 meters out. The radio screams at Kelly, "Dustoff 36, the LZ is hot. Abort! Abort!" But Kelly doesn't pull away. He doesn't climb. He descends into the maelstrom, rotor wash flattening the elephant grass as he holds a steady hover 3 feet above the ground. "Get out now," the ground commander shouts through the static. Kelly's voice comes back calm, almost serene, as bullets punch through aluminum skin and plexiglass. "When I have your wounded." For 90 seconds, the Huey sits there, rotors turning, taking fire from 3 directions. Wounded men are dragged aboard. Blood pools on the deck. The crew chief's hands are slick with it. Then, without warning, Kelly's body jerks. A single round has found its way through the chaos, through the open cockpit, through his chest, and into his heart. He gasps 2 words. "My God." His hands fall from the controls. The helicopter pitches violently upward, rolls to the left, and crashes into the paddies. The rotor blades shatter. Fuel spills. But somehow, impossibly, the crew survives. Kelly does not. He is 39 years old. He has been in Vietnam for 6 months. He has just become the father of a legend that will save nearly 1 million lives and cost hundreds more. They called him Dustoff, and he died exactly as he lived, refusing to leave without the wounded. There is a paradox at the heart of the Vietnam War that defies every principle of military logic. While the United States deployed the most sophisticated arsenal ever assembled in human history, supersonic fighter jets, strategic bombers capable of erasing grid squares, helicopter gunships bristling with rockets and miniguns, artillery batteries that could level mountainsides, there flew among them a small fleet of helicopters that carried no weapons at all. The Dustoff birds were medical evacuation helicopters, UH-1 Hueys stripped of all offensive capability, and marked with the Geneva Convention insignia, a red cross on a white square. In a war where every other aircraft was designed to kill, these machines were designed only to save, and they flew directly into the places where men were dying. This was not the safe, rear-echelon medicine of previous wars. In World War II, it took an average of 12 hours to get a wounded soldier from the battlefield to a field hospital. In Korea, helicopters began to change that equation, but Medevac remained a developing concept, often delayed by weather, darkness, or tactical considerations. In Vietnam, the 57th Medical Detachment and units like it established a new doctrine: immediate response, day or night, regardless of enemy fire, regardless of weather, regardless of risk. The promise was absolute. If you were wounded in Vietnam and you could reach a radio, Dustoff would come. It didn't matter if you were American Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or even Viet Cong. The Red Cross meant neutrality. The call sign meant salvation. And the men who flew those missions meant every word of their creed. No compromise, no rationalization, no hesitation, fly the mission now. Major Charles L. Kelly didn't invent medical evacuation, but he forged its soul. When he took command of the 57th Medical Detachment in January 1964, the unit had 5 aging UH-1B helicopters and 9 pilots. There was no established doctrine for combat medevac, no manual, no precedent. Kelly and his men wrote the rules in blood and aviation fuel. making decisions in real time under fire that would become the foundation of aeromedical evacuation for the next 6 decades. Kelly himself flew a punishing schedule that bordered on the suicidal. He pioneered a technique called scarfing, flying low over the Mekong Delta region, announcing his presence on the radio, asking units if they had wounded rather than waiting back at base for distress calls. This cut response times in half. It also meant Kelly was constantly in the air, constantly exposed, constantly gambling that he could reach men before they bled out. During one mission, enemy fire struck his helicopter's fuel line. JP-4 aviation fuel began spraying from the ruptured line, vaporizing in the hot exhaust. Any spark could turn the Huey into a fireball. Kelly had wounded men aboard. He chose to complete the mission. The engine quit on landing, the tank completely dry. Kelly climbed out, inspected the damage, and prepared for the next flight. But Kelly faced enemies beyond the Viet Cong. He fought 2 simultaneous bureaucratic wars that threatened to destroy Dustoff before it could prove itself. The first was against staff officers in the Army Surgeon General's aviation branch, who deflected his desperate requests for more pilots. These men, safe in offices thousands of miles from the jungle, simply could not comprehend what it meant to fly Medevac in a combat zone. They treated Kelly's pleas as exaggerations. The second battle was against Brigadier General Joseph W. Stilwell, Jr., commander of the U.S. Army Support Group, who wanted to use the 57th's helicopters for general-purpose missions, hauling ammunition, transporting troops, moving supplies, whenever they weren't actively flying wounded. To Stilwell, an idle helicopter was a wasted asset. To Kelly, every moment spent on logistics was a moment some soldier might die waiting for extraction. Kelly won the second fight through sheer force of will and an uncompromising operational tempo that proved the 57th couldn't be spared for other duties. But he didn't live long enough to win the first. On July 1, 1964, near Vinh Long, Kelly brought his Huey into a landing zone under heavy fire to retrieve wounded ARVN soldiers and their American advisors. When the ground commander radioed him to abort, Kelly's response entered military legend. "When I have your wounded." He maintained his hover as bullets struck the aircraft from all sides. Then one round found him. It pierced his heart. He died at the controls. The helicopter crashed, but his crew survived to tell the story. The United States awarded Kelly the Distinguished Service Cross. South Vietnam gave him the Cross of Gallantry and the National Order of Vietnam, their highest decoration. But the greatest tribute came from his own men. When asked if Dustoff would adopt more conservative tactics after Kelly's death, Captain Patrick H. Brady answered without hesitation. The 57th would continue flying missions exactly as Kelly had taught them, without hesitation, anytime, anywhere. Brady meant it. Years later, he would earn the Medal of Honor doing exactly that. Between 1962 and 1973, Dustoff units evacuated approximately 900,000 casualties from the battlefields of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. To understand the magnitude of that number, consider this. It represents nearly every American serviceman who deployed to Vietnam during the entire war. It includes tens of thousands of South Vietnamese soldiers, civilians caught in crossfire, and even enemy combatants who became patients the moment they were loaded aboard. The average response time from the moment a medevac was requested to wheels down at a field hospital was 35 minutes. In World War II, that figure was 12 hours. In Korea, it dropped to 4 hours. In Vietnam, Dustoff crews turned battlefield medicine into emergency room medicine, delivered by air under fire, in conditions that would ground commercial helicopters anywhere else in the world. The survival rate for casualties who reached a medical facility alive was the highest in the history of warfare up to that point. If a wounded soldier made it onto a Dustoff bird with a pulse, his chances of survival exceeded 97%. Surgeons at field hospitals marveled at this statistic. They credited it entirely to speed. Golden hour medicine, the principle that survival rates plummet after the first 60 minutes of trauma, became the driving obsession of every Dustoff crew. They flew as if every second mattered because every second did. But these numbers, impressive as they are, conceal a darker truth. Dustoff crews paid for those survival rates with their own blood. Approximately 1 in 3 dust-off crewmen, pilots, crew chiefs, and medics were killed or wounded during their tours. This casualty rate was higher than infantry units, higher than door gunners, higher than nearly any other specialty in the U.S. military. 210 dust-off pilots died in Vietnam. More than 500 crew chiefs and medics were killed or wounded. These men flew unarmed helicopters into landing zones that even gunships approached with caution. They hovered in the open while enemy soldiers, often less than 100 meters away, fired on them with AK-47s, machine guns, and rocket-propelled grenades. The Red Cross painted on their aircraft was supposed to grant them protection under international law. In practice, it often served as an aiming point. The 57th Medical Detachment alone, the unit Charles Kelly commanded, flew more than 22,000 missions during the war. They evacuated over 40,000 patients. At peak operational tempo during the Tet Offensive in 1968, dust-off units across Vietnam were flying around the clock, some crews logging 20-hour shifts without rest. Pilots would land, refuel, take on more wounded, and launch again before the rotors stopped turning. Individual dust-off pilots accumulated mission counts that seemed statistically impossible. Major Patrick Brady flew more than 2,000 combat missions. Warrant Officer Steve Vermillion logged 1,452 missions and evacuated 2,217 casualties during his tour. These men weren't flying cargo runs or administrative flights. Every single mission was a response to someone wounded, someone dying, someone who would be dead in an hour without intervention. The aircraft themselves tell the story. Maintenance records from the 57th Medical Detachment show that every UH-1 in the unit sustained battle damage multiple times. Bullet holes in tail booms, shattered windscreens, severed hydraulic lines, punctured fuel cells. One helicopter, tail number 64-13876, was hit by enemy fire on 37 separate occasions. It flew its last mission with more than 100 bullet holes stitched across its fuselage. The crew chief counted them personally. The emotional toll was incalculable. Dust-off crews didn't just see combat. They absorbed it. They landed in the immediate aftermath of ambushes, firefights, and mortar barrages. They loaded men with sucking chest wounds, with limbs held on by shreds of tissue, with burns covering 70% of their bodies. They held pressure on femoral arteries while the helicopter climbed. They performed CPR at 2,000 feet. And when they landed at the field hospital and handed their patients over to the surgeons, they refueled and went back out. There was no rotation, no downtime, no safe missions. Every scramble could be the one where the enemy got lucky. Every landing zone could be the place where the mathematics of violence finally caught up. And yet, across 11 years of war, across hundreds of thousands of missions, dust-off crews maintained their founding principle. They never refused a call. They never delayed for safer conditions. They never waited for gunship escorts if waiting meant a soldier would die. The statistics are impressive. The survival rates are remarkable. But behind every number is a moment of decision. A pilot choosing to descend into fire, a crew chief pulling a dying man through a door while bullets crack past his head, a medic compressing a chest wound with his own hands as the helicopter takes evasive maneuvers. The data shows what dust-off accomplished. The missions show what it cost. The history of dust-off is written in after-action reports, mission logs, and Medal of Honor citations. But its truth lives in the voices of the men who flew. Ernie Sylvester was a pilot with the 57th Medical Detachment. He was there on July 1, 1964, the day Charles Kelly died. Decades later, his voice would crack slightly when he recalled the final radio transmission. Major Kelly and Dick Anderson went into the LZ. It was hot. They were told it was hot. They got down on the ground. The soldiers on the ground were pinned down. Major Kelly, they told him to leave the LZ. They were taking fire. Major Kelly said, "Not until I have all your wounded." Sylvester paused in his oral history interview, the silence heavy with memory. "That was Major Kelly," he continued. "That was who he was. And that's who we all became." Robert Smithy served as a medic with the 4th and 58th Medical Battalions. He watched dust-off crews operate during some of the heaviest fighting of the war. His testimony captures the relentless operational tempo. They worked as hard as anybody I ever saw. They were utterly, totally committed, and I know some of them must have stayed on 24 hours every time, just coming and going, and fueled up and go right back out again, so, yeah, they were something else. Something else. The phrase barely contains what it describes. Men operating beyond normal human endurance, beyond fear, beyond the self-preservation instinct that keeps most people alive. Warrant Officer Steve Vermillion flew 1,452 missions during his tour. He evacuated 2,217 casualties. In his personal account, he describes a night mission during the monsoon season, flying through zero visibility conditions to reach a special forces camp under attack. I couldn't see the ground until we were 10 feet above it, he recalled. I couldn't see the trees until we were in them. But there were men dying down there, and they'd called for us, and that was enough. The helicopter took fire during the extraction. A bullet passed through the plexiglass inches from Vermillion's head. He didn't abort. He didn't even flinch. He loaded 6 wounded Green Berets and flew them out through the same corridor of fire. When he landed at the field hospital and shut down the aircraft, his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't unbuckle his harness. He sat in the cockpit for 10 minutes, alone, waiting for his body to catch up with what his mind had just done. Then he refueled and flew another mission. Major Patrick Brady became a legend even among legends. During his second tour as a dust-off pilot, on January 6, 1968, he flew 3 separate helicopters on the same day because the first 2 were shot up so badly they couldn't continue flying. He evacuated 51 seriously wounded men. He landed in minefields, hovered in zero visibility, and at one point dragged wounded soldiers to his helicopter using a cargo rope because the landing zone was too small for the aircraft itself. His Medal of Honor citation reads like fiction. With complete disregard for his safety, Major Brady descended through heavy ground fire to evacuate the wounded. When his primary helicopter was damaged by hostile fire, he immediately requested another and continued the mission. During the extraction, his aircraft was struck by heavy automatic weapons and rocket fire. Despite the extreme danger, Major Brady calmly continued his mission. But the citation doesn't mention what Brady said afterward, in a quiet moment away from the ceremony and the cameras. I didn't do anything special, he insisted. I did exactly what Major Kelly taught us to do. I flew the mission. That's all. That's what dust-off means. The letters home tell a different story than the official records. One pilot, whose name was redacted from the Vietnam archive collection, wrote to his wife in March 1969. I can't describe what it's like to land in a place where men are dying and know that you're the only thing between them and death. The weight of that is crushing, but worse would be not going. Worse would be hearing the radio call and doing nothing. I think about Major Kelly every single day. I think about his last words, and I go. Another crew chief wrote in his diary after a particularly horrific mission. Today we pulled a kid out who was 19 years old, same age as me. He'd been hit in the stomach. He kept asking if he was going to make it. I told him yes. I lied. He died in my arms before we reached the hospital. I don't know his name. I'll never forget his face. These are the voices that carried dust-off through the war, not the speeches, not the doctrine, not the statistics, just men who refused to let other men die alone. In January 1962, the 1st U.S. Army Medical Helicopter Unit arrived in Vietnam with exactly 5 UH-1 helicopters. The 57th Medical Detachment set up operations at Tan Son Nut Air Base outside Saigon with a simple mandate: provide aeromedical evacuation for American advisors and their South Vietnamese counterparts. The war was still small then, still contained, still something Washington believed could be managed with limited commitment. By December 1968, at the height of American involvement, there were 8 dedicated dust-off detachments operating across South Vietnam with more than 100 helicopters. The 57th, 54th, 82nd, 159th, 236th, 247th, 254th, and 498th medical detachments formed a network that covered every province from the demilitarized zone in the north to the Kea Mau Peninsula in the south, from the coastal plains to the Cambodian border. This expansion mirrored the war's metastasis. As American troop strength grew from 16,000 advisors in 1963 to more than 540,000 personnel by 1969, the demand for Medevac grew proportionally. But Dustoff's coverage exceeded simple mathematics. The units didn't just scale up, they penetrated every combat environment Vietnam could produce, adapting their tactics to jungles, rice paddies, mountains, and urban warfare in real time. In the Mekong Delta, where the 57th pioneered scarfing missions, Dustoff crews flew low over the endless waterways and rice paddies, navigating by visual reference in a landscape where every tree line could hide an ambush. The Delta was deceptive terrain, flat and open from altitude, but at ground level a maze of canals, dikes, and vegetation that made navigation treacherous and landing zones nearly impossible to secure. Pilots learned to read the wind patterns on the rice stalks, to judge rotor clearance by eye, to land in spaces barely larger than their rotor diameter. In the Central Highlands, the 82nd and 159th Medical Detachments faced different challenges. The terrain was mountainous, covered in triple canopy jungle where the forest floor never saw direct sunlight. Landing zones had to be carved out of the jungle with explosives or chainsaws, and even then they were often nothing more than a gap in the trees barely wide enough for a single helicopter. Pilots would hover while crew chiefs lowered rescue hoists through 100-foot canopy, winching wounded men up one at a time, completely exposed to ground fire below. The most dangerous operations occurred along the DMZ and in the northern provinces near the Laotian border. Here, North Vietnamese Army regulars operated with heavy weapons, 12.7mm anti-aircraft guns, 37mm cannons, and after 1972, even shoulder-fired SA-7 surface-to-air missiles. The 236th Medical Detachment at Phu Bai and the 54th at Da Nang flew into what amounted to an air defense zone every time they crossed into combat areas. During the siege of Khe Sanh from January to July 1968, Dustoff crews flew into the base under constant artillery bombardment. North Vietnamese gunners had pre-registered every landing zone with mortars and rockets. The moment a helicopter touched down, the enemy would fire for effect. Pilots learned to land, load, and launch in less than 60 seconds. Some missions were completed in 45 seconds from skids down to skids up. The wounded were thrown aboard more than loaded. There was no time for gentleness when survival measured in heartbeats. Night missions became routine after 1966, despite the fact that UH-1 helicopters had minimal night-flying instrumentation. Pilots flew by reference to the horizon when they could see it, by instinct when they couldn't. Crew chiefs would mark landing zones with infrared strobes visible only through night vision goggles. Sometimes the only reference point was the muzzle flash of enemy weapons firing at them. More than one pilot navigated by tracer fire, following the arc of bullets back to their source because that's where the wounded were. Urban evacuation became a specialty during the Tet Offensive when fighting erupted inside cities that had been considered secure. In Saigon, Dustoff crews landed on the U.S. Embassy roof under mortar fire to evacuate wounded Marines. In Hue City, they flew into street intersections, threading between buildings while snipers fired from windows. The missions required precision flying that exceeded anything in the training manuals. One pilot described it as flying a school bus through a hallway at 60 miles per hour while people shoot at you. By war's end, there was no place in Vietnam a Dustoff helicopter hadn't reached. They'd landed on mountaintops at 6,000 feet, in jungle clearings 20 meters wide, on highways under fire, in rice paddies so soft the skids sank to the cross tubes. They'd flown in monsoons that grounded everything else, in dust storms that turned the air into sandpaper, in heat that made the engines scream and the pilots pour sweat. Wherever American soldiers fought, Dustoff flew. The promise was geographic. The commitment was absolute. January 30th, 1968, 2:45 a.m. Across South Vietnam, in more than 100 cities and military installations, North Vietnamese Army regulars and Viet Cong guerrillas launched simultaneous attacks. The Tet Offensive had begun. Within hours, the illusion that America was winning the war would shatter. But before that collapse of confidence came a collapse of bodies, Tens of thousands of casualties in the first 72 hours, overwhelming every medical facility in the country. The dust-off frequency exploded with distress calls. Saigon was under attack. Hue City was under siege. Da Nang, Pleiku, Kontum, Quang Tri, Can Tho. Every major city and dozens of smaller towns reported enemy contact. Fire bases along the Cambodian border called for urgent Medevac. Special forces camps in the Central Highlands screamed for extraction. The volume of calls exceeded anything the Medevac units had experienced. There simply weren't enough helicopters. The dust-off crews responded the only way they knew how. They stopped sleeping. Pilots flew back-to-back missions until their hands cramped on the controls. Crew chiefs and medics worked until they vomited from exhaustion, then kept working. Maintenance personnel turned 12-hour shifts into 24-hour marathons, repairing battle damage by flashlight, cannibalizing parts from one aircraft to keep another flying. In Saigon, the 57th Medical Detachment launched from Tan Son Nut Air Base into a city transformed into a battlefield. Viet Cong sappers had penetrated the U.S. Embassy compound. Fighting raged around Chalon, the Chinese district. The presidential palace was under attack. Dust-off crews flew between buildings, landed on rooftops, evacuated wounded from street corners while firefights continued 50 meters away. One mission report from February 1st describes a landing at the embassy itself. The pilot, a warrant officer whose name appears in the file only as W.O. Martinez, brought his Huey down on the compound grounds while enemy soldiers were still inside the perimeter. Marine security guards threw 3 wounded men aboard. Martinez didn't wait for the crew chief's all-clear signal. He pulled pitch while the last Marine was still halfway through the door, climbing out so steeply that the wounded fell backward onto the deck. The helicopter took 6 hits on departure. All 3 patients survived. 300 miles north in Hue City, the situation was catastrophic. North Vietnamese forces had captured nearly the entire city, including the historic citadel. U.S. Marines and South Vietnamese troops were fighting building to building, room to room. The casualties were mounting faster than ground ambulances could move. The roads were blocked. The only way out was up. Dust-off pilots began landing in city streets. They would hover while crew chiefs scanned for enemy soldiers in the windows above. Sometimes they'd spot muzzle flashes and have to abort. Other times they'd complete the pickup and take fire on climb-out. Bullets punching through thin aluminum like paper. One helicopter was hit so many times during a Hue extraction that mechanics later counted 73 holes. The pilot had felt the impacts but hadn't seen the damage. He'd flown 2 more missions before maintenance grounded the aircraft. At Khe Sanh Combat Base, already under siege since mid-January, Tet brought intensified bombardment. North Vietnamese artillery fired more than 1,300 rounds per day into the base. Every landing zone was pre-registered for enemy mortars. Dust-off crews flying into Khe Sanh knew they'd take fire. The only question was whether they'd survive it. During one mission on February 8th, a dust-off helicopter piloted by Major Patrick Brady landed at Khe Sanh to evacuate critically wounded Marines. As the wounded were loaded, enemy mortars began impacting around the landing zone. A round struck 10 meters from the helicopter. Shrapnel punctured the fuel cell. JP-4 began streaming from the tank. Brady had wounded aboard and more waiting. He chose to continue. He loaded 12 men in a space designed for 6, fuel still pouring from the ruptured tank, and lifted off. The engine quit halfway to Da Nang. Brady auto-rotated into a clearing, transferred the wounded to another helicopter, and walked away from the crashed aircraft. Then he got another helicopter and flew more missions. Across the country, this scene repeated in hundreds of variations. Pilots flew damaged aircraft. Crew chiefs worked wounded. Medics treated patients while taking fire. The operational tempo exceeded sustainability, exceeded rationality, exceeded everything except necessity. In the first week of Tet, dust-off units evacuated more than 10,000 casualties. Some pilots logged 40 missions in 5 days. Sleep became a memory. Food was eaten cold from cans between flights. Helicopters landed at field hospitals, transferred patients, refueled and launched without shutting down. The Tet offensive broke America's will to continue the war. Walter Cronkite declared it a stalemate. Public support collapsed. But in the chaos and carnage of those first terrible weeks, one thing didn't break. Dust off. Every call was answered. Every wounded soldier was reached. The promise held. The enemy learned. That was the nightmare progression of the war. Every tactic the Americans developed, the North Vietnamese studied, adapted, and countered. Dust-off was no exception. By 1969, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces had implemented systematic procedures for engaging medical evacuation helicopters. Communist training manuals captured during operations explicitly identified Medevac helicopters as priority targets. The reasoning was coldly tactical. Destroying a dust-off bird didn't just kill 4 Americans. It demoralized every soldier who knew that their lifeline could be cut. It forced subsequent Medevac crews to approach more cautiously, slowing response times, lowering survival rates. It was psychological warfare calibrated to attack the one guarantee American soldiers had, that if they fell, someone would come. The weapons evolved. Early in the war, dust-off crews faced primarily small arms fire, AK-47s, SKS rifles, occasional machine guns. Dangerous, yes, but survivable. UH-1 helicopters could absorb dozens of small-caliber rounds and keep flying. By 1970, the enemy was deploying .51 caliber DSHK heavy machine guns specifically positioned along known Medevac routes. These weapons could tear through a Huey's transmission, sever tail rotor control cables, or kill a pilot with a single round. Rocket-propelled grenades became commonplace. The RPG-7, introduced in large numbers after 1968, could destroy a helicopter with one hit. Enemy soldiers learned to wait until the dust-off was in its most vulnerable position, hovering in a landing zone, rotors turning at full power, unable to maneuver, and then fire from concealed positions at ranges under 100 meters. Many crews never saw the shooter until the grenade was in the air. The most terrifying development came in 1972, the SA-7 Grail, a Soviet-made shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile. Heat-seeking, fire and forget, capable of reaching 8,000 feet. The SA-7 changed the calculus of helicopter operations across Vietnam. For the first time, there was a weapon that could chase a dust-off bird through evasive maneuvers and detonate its warhead on contact. Crews had no countermeasures. Flares weren't standard equipment until late in the war. The only defense was to fly low, fly fast, and pray. And yet, the doctrine never changed. Dust-off crews didn't arm their helicopters. While gunships like the AH-1 Cobra bristled with miniguns, grenade launchers, and rocket pods, and even transport Hueys mounted door guns for self-defense, dust-off birds remained completely unarmed. The Red Cross meant something. It meant these men came to save lives, not take them. It meant neutrality. It meant medicine. The North Vietnamese didn't honor that distinction. Neither did the Viet Cong. But dust-off crews maintained it anyway, not because it protected them, it manifestly did not, but because it defined them. Patrick Brady, who rose to command the 54th Medical Detachment, articulated the philosophy. The moment we mount weapons, we're no longer dust-off. We're just another gunship, and that means we've lost the moral authority to demand that enemy soldiers not shoot at us. So they flew faster. They developed techniques for steep approaches and rapid departures that minimized exposure time. They flew at night without lights, navigating by infrared and instinct. They flew in weather that grounded attack helicopters and transport aircraft. If a mission could physically be flown, dust-off flew it. The price escalated. In 1965, 6 dust-off crewmen were killed in action. In 1968, that number rose to 42. In 1969, 38 more died. The cumulative losses mounted to a casualty rate that exceeded most infantry units. To put it in perspective, a rifleman in Vietnam had approximately a 15% chance of being killed or wounded during a one-year tour. A dust-off crewman had a 33% chance. Major Patrick Brady's Medal of Honor mission on January 6, 1968, exemplifies the extreme measures these men took. He flew 3 different helicopters that day because the first 2 were shot up beyond airworthiness. The first aircraft took multiple hits to the engine and transmission during a landing zone approach. Brady nursed it back to base, transferred to a second helicopter, and immediately returned to the same area. The second helicopter was struck by heavy machine gun fire that shattered the windscreen and severed hydraulic lines. Brady landed at a field hospital, switched to a third aircraft, and continued flying missions. In total, he evacuated 51 wounded men. He landed in minefields where ground troops refused to walk. He hovered in zero visibility, guiding his aircraft by verbal directions from ground personnel he couldn't see. At one point, the landing zone was too small for the helicopter. Brady hovered outside the perimeter while his crew chief threw a rope to ground troops who tied wounded soldiers to the line. Brady then dragged them through the jungle to a larger clearing where they could be loaded. This wasn't heroism as a single moment of courage. This was heroism as systematic defiance of death, repeated mission after mission, hour after hour, until the last wounded man was evacuated or the last helicopter was destroyed. And when the helicopters were destroyed, dust-off crews got new ones and kept flying. There is a specific kind of trauma that comes from saving lives while others die in your arms. It has no clean diagnosis, no easy treatment, no expiration date. The men who flew dust-off missions carried it home in their bodies like shrapnel too deep to extract. Imagine the psychological calculus. You are a 23-year-old helicopter pilot. You have been in Vietnam for 7 months. You have flown 437 combat missions. You have evacuated 612 casualties. Of those, 37 died aboard your aircraft despite everything you and your medic could do. You can remember each one. Not statistically, specifically. The 19-year-old from Tennessee with the sucking chest wound who stopped breathing at 1,500 feet. The sergeant from California whose femoral artery you couldn't clamp. The 18-year-old who kept asking for his mother and died still asking. You remember them because you were there in the moments that defined whether they lived or died. You held altitude and airspeed while your crew chief performed CPR. You flew faster than you should have. Pushed the engine beyond limits, risked structural failure because maybe if you could get to the hospital 3 minutes sooner it would matter. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. And you never knew which factor. Your flying, the medic's skill, the severity of the wounds, the grace of God, the randomness of biology, determined the outcome. Now multiply that experience by hundreds of missions. Add the guilt of survival. You are flying above the battle while men below are dying. You are returning to base to hot meals and cots while infantry soldiers sleep in mud. You are relatively safe, except when you're not, except when you're hovering over a hot landing zone taking fire from 3 directions, completely exposed, absolutely vulnerable. The psychological whiplash between safety and mortal danger, repeated multiple times per day, fractures something fundamental in the nervous system. The moral injuries cut deeper than physical wounds. There were missions dust-off crews couldn't fly because the weather was too severe, or the tactical situation was too dangerous even by their standards. Those calls haunted them forever. A voice on the radio. Dust off, we have urgent surgical, multiple casualties requesting immediate medevac. And the response, forced through clenched teeth. Unable to launch at this time due to weather. We'll retry at first light. Then silence. Then, hours later, the follow-up call. Cancel medevac request. All patients expired. The crews knew intellectually that some missions were impossible. That flying blind through a thunderstorm at night into an unsecured landing zone wasn't bravery. It was suicide that would kill 4 more men without saving anyone. But intellect provides no protection against guilt. The question remained unanswerable and corrosive. What if I had tried? What if I had launched? What if those men died waiting for me because I chose to live? Some pilots stopped sleeping, not because of nightmares, though those came too, but because sleep felt like betrayal. Somewhere, right now, someone might be wounded. Someone might need extraction. How could you sleep when the radio might call? Crews developed rituals of hypervigilance that persisted long after their tours ended. They would wake at 3 a.m. in their homes in America, decades later convinced they'd missed a mission. The rage was equally destructive. Dust-off crews operated under rules of engagement that forbade them from firing on the enemy even in self-defense. They watched muzzle flashes from tree lines, knew exactly where the shooters were, and could do nothing but take evasive action. Meanwhile, the same enemy soldiers who'd just shot at them would be treated if they were wounded, loaded aboard the same helicopter, given the same medical care. Some crew chiefs and medics struggled with this contradiction. One medic, interviewed decades later, described working frantically to save a North Vietnamese soldier who'd been shot in the abdomen. The soldier survived. 2 days later, the same medic's unit came under attack. His closest friend was killed. "I saved that man's life," the medic said, his voice flat with exhaustion even 50 years later. "And maybe he went back out and killed my friend. Maybe he didn't. I'll never know. But I think about it every single day." The culture of dust-off demanded absolute commitment. No compromise, no rationalization, no hesitation. Charles Kelly's words became liturgy, repeated so often they ceased to be instructions and became identity. But identity forged under such extreme pressure doesn't turn off when the war ends. The men who internalized that creed, who became the kind of people who would fly into hell without hesitation, couldn't unbecome those people when they returned home. Patrick Brady, Medal of Honor recipient, commander of dust-off units, would later describe the psychological cost. "We measured success by how many lives we saved, but we measured failure by how many we lost. And failure felt personal, even when it wasn't. Every soldier who died despite our best efforts felt like our failure. That's not rational. That's not fair to ourselves. But that's what it felt like." The survivors' guilt was compounded by the nature of the casualties. Dust-off crews didn't just evacuate strangers, they evacuated friends. In a war where units rotated individually rather than as cohesive groups, and where soldiers moved between assignments, you might medevac the guy you'd played cards with last week. You might load a kid who'd asked you about flying lessons. You might look down at a face on the stretcher and recognize it. One pilot described finding his own brother among the casualties during a routine pickup. He didn't know his brother's infantry unit was in the area. He landed. Crew chief started loading wounded, and there on the ground was his younger brother, 19 years old, hit in the chest and legs. The pilot flew the mission. He held it together. He got his brother to the hospital. Then he landed, shut down the aircraft, walked behind the operations tent, and collapsed. Other pilots found him there 20 minutes later, still unable to speak. His brother survived, but the pilot never flew the same way again. Every wounded soldier became his brother. Every mission became personal. He finished his tour, went home, and spent the next 40 years unable to talk about Vietnam without his hands shaking. The transformation wasn't always destructive. Some men found meaning in the trauma. They'd lived through the worst moments of human existence, and they'd responded by saving lives. That meant something. It had to mean something, or else the cost was unbearable. These men became advocates, counselors, mentors to younger veterans. They formed associations and reunions, gathering annually to remind each other that what they'd done mattered. But the darkness never entirely left. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't officially recognized until 1980, 7 years after the last American combat troops left Vietnam. The dust-off crews who came home in 1969, 1970, 1971 had no diagnosis for what they were experiencing. They had nightmares, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, survivor's guilt, and moral injury, but no framework to understand it, no treatment to address it, and often no support system to help them carry it. Many self-medicated with alcohol. Some disappeared into isolation. Others threw themselves into work, into constant motion, into anything that prevented them from stopping long enough to remember. The divorce rates were catastrophic. The suicide rates were worse. The VA system, overwhelmed and underfunded, often failed them completely. One crew chief's testimony cuts to the heart of it. "I came home and people asked what I did in Vietnam. I told them I flew Medevac. They'd say, 'Oh, so you didn't really see combat?' And I'd just nod. Because how do you explain that I saw more combat than most infantry soldiers? That I flew into firefights multiple times per day? That I held dying men in my arms? That I can still smell the blood? You can't explain it. So you don't try. You just carry it. Alone." The psychological transformation was permanent. These men went to Vietnam as helicopter pilots, crew chiefs, and medics. They came home as something else, wounded in ways that didn't show on X-rays, carrying scars that never healed, defined forever by missions they couldn't forget and men they couldn't save. April 17, 1975. The last American helicopters lifted off from the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. The war was over. America lost. And for the men who'd flown dust-off missions, a different kind of battle began. One fought not in the jungles of Vietnam, but in the quiet destruction of their own minds and the indifference of a nation that wanted to forget. The homecoming was brutal in its silence. There were no parades for Medevac crews, no ceremonies, no public recognition. Most dust-off veterans returned to an America that didn't want to hear about Vietnam, didn't want to acknowledge what had been done in its name, and certainly didn't want to confront the human cost. The men who'd saved nearly 900,000 lives came home to a country that treated them not as heroes, but as reminders of a failed war. The medical establishment of the 1970s had no framework for what these men were experiencing. Nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, emotional numbness. These symptoms were dismissed as weakness or moral failure. The term post-traumatic stress disorder wouldn't enter the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders until 1980, and even then treatment was primitive and often ineffective. Dust-off crews struggled in particular ways. Unlike infantry veterans who could point to clear combat experiences, firefights, ambushes, direct enemy contact, Medevac crews had a more complex trauma. They'd been shot at, yes, but they'd also been caregivers. They'd held dying men. They'd made split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died. The guilt wasn't just survivor's guilt. It was the specific anguish of wondering if you'd done enough, if you could have flown faster, landed more precisely, saved one more life. The statistics tell part of the story. Studies conducted in the 1980s and 1990s found that Vietnam helicopter pilots and crew members had PTSD rates exceeding 40%, significantly higher than ground combat troops. Among dust-off-specific personnel, the rates were even higher. One Department of Veterans Affairs study in 1988 found that 53% of surveyed Medevac crew members met the clinical criteria for PTSD 15 years after the war ended. But statistics can't capture the texture of those decades. The marriages that failed because a man couldn't sleep through the night, couldn't tolerate crowds, couldn't explain why the sound of a helicopter sent him into panic. The careers that never started because showing up to a job every day required a stability these men didn't have. The 4th of July celebrations they couldn't attend because fireworks sounded too much like incoming mortars. The slow erosion of hope as years passed and the trauma didn't diminish. Some found solace in community. Steve Vermillion, who'd flown 1,452 missions and evacuated 2,217 casualties, became president of the Vietnam Dust-Off Association. The organization, formed in the 1980s, brought together pilots, crew chiefs, medics, and maintenance personnel who'd served in Medevac units. The reunions were both healing and painful. Men sharing experiences they'd never told anyone else, but also confronting memories they'd spent decades trying to suppress. Patrick Brady, the Medal of Honor recipient, became an advocate for veterans' mental health. He spoke publicly about his own struggles with PTSD, using his decorated status to break through the stigma. "I flew hundreds of combat missions," he told a VA conference in 1987. "I saved lives, I earned medals, and I came home broken." Those things aren't contradictory. They're connected. The same commitment that made me a good dust-off pilot made me vulnerable to trauma. We need to understand that. The recognition came slowly, inadequately, and often posthumously. In 2008, Congress passed a resolution honoring dust-off crews, 40 years after the peak of their operations. In 2016, the Army established the Dust-Off Association Hall of Fame. These gestures mattered to the men who received them, but they couldn't restore what had been lost. The years of suffering without support, the friends who'd committed suicide, the families that had been destroyed. The most significant recognition came on December 21, 2023, when President Biden signed legislation awarding the Congressional Gold Medal collectively to dust-off crews who served in Vietnam. The ceremony took place on March 18, 2024, nearly 50 years after the war ended. Steve Vermillion, now 76 years old, accepted the medal on behalf of all dust-off personnel, living and dead. In his acceptance speech, Vermillion's voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he held the medal. "This honor belongs to 210 pilots who never came home," he said. "To more than 500 crew chiefs and medics killed or wounded. To every man who climbed into an unarmed helicopter and flew into hell because that's what dust-off meant. We didn't do it for medals. We did it because soldiers were dying and we'd promised to come. But I'm grateful that finally America remembers." The audience, filled with aging veterans and their families, rose in standing ovation. Some were crying. Others stood at attention, eyes forward, locked in memories that will never entirely fade. The recognition mattered, but it came too late for too many. Charles Kelly died in 1964. He never saw dust-off become the legend it became. He never knew that his philosophy, no compromise, no rationalization, fly the mission, now, would define a generation of aviators. He never knew that 60 years later, his name would still be spoken with reverence by men who'd adopted his creed. The long shadow of Vietnam stretches across decades. The men who flew dust-off missions are in their 70s and 80s now. Each year, the reunions grow smaller. Each year, more names are added to the memorial walls. But the legacy persists. Modern military Medevac doctrine, the commitment to reach every wounded soldier, the acceptance of risk, the refusal to leave anyone behind, traces directly to those 5 UH-1 helicopters and 9 pilots who started flying missions in 1962. The debt America owes these men can never be fully repaid, but at minimum, the nation can remember, can acknowledge, can ensure that the sacrifice wasn't forgotten even if it was delayed in recognition. The dust-off crews didn't ask for glory. They asked only that wounded soldiers be saved. They succeeded, and they paid for that success with decades of trauma that most of them are still carrying. The history of dust-off is the history of a promise kept at unfathomable cost. It is the story of men who chose every single day to fly unarmed helicopters into the worst places human beings can create. It is the story of a doctrine that refused compromise, rejected rationalization, and demanded immediate action regardless of danger. And it is the story of sacrifice that most Americans never knew about and fewer still truly understood. Consider what these men achieved. Between 1962 and 1973, dust-off crews evacuated approximately 900,000 casualties from combat zones across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The survival rate for wounded who reached medical facilities was the highest in the history of warfare. Soldiers who would have died in previous conflicts, from blood loss, from shock, from injuries too severe to survive the long evacuation times of World War II or Korea, lived because a helicopter arrived in 35 minutes instead of 4 hours. The average infantryman in Vietnam knew this statistic viscerally. He knew that if he was hit, if he could reach a radio, if he could transmit a grid coordinate, dust-off would come. That knowledge changed the psychological calculus of combat. It didn't make soldiers fearless. Nothing could do that. But it gave them hope. And hope in war is the difference between fighting and surrendering. But consider also what it cost. 210 pilots dead. More than 500 crew chiefs and medics killed or wounded. A casualty rate of 1 in 3. Higher than infantry, higher than door gunners, higher than nearly any other specialty in the U.S. military. These men flew unarmed into hot landing zones. They hovered in the open while enemy soldiers, often less than 100 meters away, fired on them with machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades. They completed missions in aircraft so damaged that mechanics would later declare them unflyable. The Red Cross painted on their helicopters was supposed to protect them. International law, the Geneva Convention, the basic human acknowledgement that medical personnel should be neutral, all of this was meant to keep them safe. It didn't. The enemy shot at them anyway. And dust-off crews kept flying anyway, not because they were naive about the danger, but because the alternative was letting wounded soldiers die. Major Charles L. Kelly died on July 1, 1964, with his last words entering military legend, "When I have your wounded." He didn't say, "When the landing zone is secure." He didn't say, "When we have gunship support." He didn't say, "When it's safe." He said, "When I have your wounded." That distinction, the absolute priority of the patient over the safety of the crew, defined Dustoff for the next 11 years of war. Patrick Brady internalized that philosophy so completely that on January 6, 1968, he flew 3 separate helicopters because the first 2 were destroyed by enemy fire, and he refused to stop flying missions. He evacuated 51 wounded men that day. He earned the Medal of Honor. But more importantly, he preserved Kelly's legacy. He proved that Dustoff would not be broken, would not compromise, would not fail. The psychological cost of that commitment lasted far longer than the war. PTSD rates among Dustoff crews exceeded 50%. Marriages failed. Careers ended. Some men committed suicide. The trauma wasn't limited to combat. It was the trauma of caring so deeply, of being so committed to saving lives, that every death felt personal, every mission that couldn't be flown felt like failure, every soldier left behind felt like betrayal. America didn't honor these men for decades. There were no parades, no public recognition. The country wanted to forget Vietnam, and in forgetting the war, it forgot the people who'd fought it with humanity, rather than weapons. The Congressional Gold Medal came in 2024, nearly 50 years too late for most of the men who earned it. But late recognition is better than no recognition. And the story of Dustoff deserves to be told, retold, and remembered. Because it's not just a story about helicopters or combat medicine or military doctrine. It's a story about the kind of courage that doesn't get movies made about it. The courage to save rather than destroy, to care in the middle of chaos, to maintain humanity in the most inhuman circumstances imaginable. It was a mission without weapons. It was a promise without conditions. It was a sacrifice without recognition, until now. The men who flew Dustoff missions were called angels. The term was earned in blood and jet fuel, in sleepless nights and missions flown through monsoons in landing zones so hot that survival seemed impossible but happened anyway because someone refused to leave without the wounded. This is their story. This is their legacy. And this is why we remember. If this story moved you, subscribe to Vietnam War Archives for more untold histories of courage and sacrifice. Share in the comments. Did you or someone in your family serve with Dustoff or Medevac units? Do you have stories of being saved by these crews? Your testimony keeps their legacy alive. Share it. Honor it. Remember it.